It was a Saturday evening. The golden lights of Mr. Coleman's mansion lit up the night like a palace. Expensive cars lined the driveway. Guests walked in wearing shiny dresses, black suits, and holding wine glasses. Everyone looked rich, proud, and important. Inside, music played softly from hidden speakers. Waiters moved around with trays of champagne and small snacks. Laughter filled the giant hall. It was one of Mr. Coleman's famous parties. Everyone who was somebody was there. Mr. Coleman himself stood near the bar wearing a deep blue suit. His gray hair was slicked back. His gold watch sparkled every time he lifted his hand. He loved throwing parties, not to enjoy but to show power, to show everyone that he was above them. "Look at them," he whispered to his friend. All smiling like puppies. They laughed together in the corner of the room near the giant grand piano. A young black maid was quietly dusting the shelves. Her name was Alma. She was new to the staff. She didn't talk much, didn't look up, and never smiled. She simply did her work and stayed out of sight. Mr. Coleman noticed her. He raised his eyebrows. "Well, look who we have here." He pointed at her loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear. Alma stopped, looking confused. Mr. Coleman grinned. "Hey, maid, what's your name again?" "Alma, sir," she answered softly. "Alma," he repeated loudly. "Tell me, Alma, do you know how to play this beautiful piano? Or is that too complicated?" Some guests chuckled. Alma hesitated. I used to learn a little, sir," she said, eyes down. "Wonderful." Mr. Coleman clapped his hands. "Let's hear something. Shall we play us a song? For fun?" The room got quieter. Few guests exchanged amused glances. It was clear this wasn't about music. It was about power, about watching the maid try and fail, so they could laugh. Alma looked nervous. Her hands shook slightly. She looked around the room and saw all the eyes on her. She thought about saying no, but something in her heart told her to walk forward. She stepped slowly toward the piano. Some guests smiled mockingly. Others looked curious. Mr. Coleman leaned on the bar, swirling his drink. "This should be fun," he whispered to someone. Alma sat down. She placed her fingers on the keys. Silence. Her heart beat faster. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Not since her mother died. Her hands hovered above the keys, I'm sure. Then she closed her eyes. She took a deep breath, and she played one note. It was clear, pure, strong. The room froze. Even Mr. Coleman stopped mid-sip. The glass slipped slightly in his hand. The second note came. Then a third. A melody began to form, one that was soft, emotional, almost haunting. Everyone was silent. No one smiled now. It wasn't just music. It was pain. It was beauty. It was memory. Alma's fingers moved slowly but confidently, her back straight, her eyes closed. She was no longer the maid. She was someone else entirely. Mr. Coleman stared at her, confused. His mouth slightly open. He looked around the room. Even the most talkative guests had gone quiet. Some even looked moved. One woman wiped a tear. A young man whispered, "Who is she?" Another man, a music teacher, leaned forward and whispered, "That song. I know that song. I haven't heard it in years." The melody grew deeper, sadder. Alma's shoulders trembled slightly. She was crying, but she didn't stop. She played. Like her soul was bleeding out through her fingers. Like the piano was the only way she could speak. The crowd was no longer a crowd. They were listeners. Witnesses, held in a moment that didn't belong to them, but to her. Mr. Coleman felt something. Strange in his chest? Guilt? No, it couldn't be. He shook his head, trying to smile it off, but the notes continued. Every chord seemed to strike deeper into the room's heart. Every key whispered something unsaid. Then the music stopped. Just like that, Alma opened her. Eyes dot her face wet with tears. No one moved. For a long time the silence held. Then slowly, one person clapped, then another. Then the room erupted into soft, respectful applause, not loud or fake, but genuine. But Mr. Coleman didn't clap. He was frozen. His eyes locked on Alma. She looked back. There was something in her eyes. Something deep. Something sad, but strong. For the first time in years, Mr. Coleman didn't feel like the richest man in the room. He felt small. He looked down at his glass, now shaking slightly in his hand. Suddenly he remembered something, an old newspaper. Article from many years ago. A picture of a young black woman playing piano on stage. Her name, her eyes, they looked just like Alma's. Could it be? But it was. After the party, the mansion returned to its usual silence. The guests were gone. Lights were dim. Only the staff stayed behind, cleaning up empty glasses and half-eaten desserts. Alma stood quietly in the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Her face showed no expression, but her eyes were still red. Not from the spotlight, but from memory. Earlier that night, she had become the center of attention. She hadn't asked for it. She didn't want it. Something inside her made her play. Now, back in the shadows, she felt safe again. Other maids whispered softly, "Did you hear her play? She was amazing." "Why is she working here?" No one asked Alma directly. They respected her silence. She wasn't the type to talk about herself. She came to work on time, did her tasks, and left quietly. Even the head butler, Mr. Harris, a strict old man who rarely praised anyone, said gently, "You played well, Alma." She nodded. "Thank you, sir." He paused. "You learned from someone?" Alma looked down. "My mother. A long time ago." That was all she said. That was all she ever said. Alma lived in a small apartment, 20 minutes away from the mansion. It had one room, one bed, and one old photograph sitting by the window. The photo showed a young woman in a long black dress, sitting at a grand piano. Her face looked like Alma's butt, softer, happier. Her name was Elaine Weston, Alma's mother. Alma stared at the photo as she removed her uniform and sat down on the bed. "I played your song tonight, Alma," she whispered. Tears rolled down her cheeks again. She hadn't touched a piano in almost 10 years. Not since the funeral. Back then, Alma was just 12 years old. Her mother was a rising pianista, star in the classical music world. She had played in halls across the country. People called her the Lady of the Keys. But fame didn't protect her. Elaine Weston was accused of stealing music from a white composer. The media turned against her. Sponsors dropped her. Concert halls canceled bookings. Her career ended almost overnight. Alma remembered how her mother sat at their old piano, staring at the keys but not playing. The music inside her had died. One cold winter evening, Elaine never woke up. Some said it was sickness. Others whispered about heartbreak. Alma knew the truth. Her mother had been destroyed by lies, by power, by racism. After that, Alma stopped playing. She sold the old piano, moved from city to city, took whatever job she could find, cleaning houses, folding laundry, serving rich families. She never told anyone her last name, and she never played a single note, until tonight, the next morning at the mansion. Something had changed. Staff were quiet around Alma, not in fear, but in awe. Some even looked at her with kindness. The guards at the gate nodded when she entered. The cook offered her tea. Mr. Coleman didn't come downstairs. He usually barked orders at everyone before breakfast today. He was silent. Alma didn't care. She had planned to keep her head down, return to her cleaning, forget the piano ever happened. But the world had already noticed. Later that afternoon, a guest returned to the mansion. His name was Mr. Becker, a journalist from a major newspaper. He had been at the party. He had heard Alma play, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. "May I speak to her?" Mr. Becker asked the butler. Mr. Harris hesitated. "She's just a maid, sir." Mr. Becker smiled. "She's more than that." The back garden. Alma was watering flowers. She didn't turn when she heard footsteps behind her. "I'm not here to bother you," said a soft voice. She glanced over her shoulder. The man was in his 40s, wearing glasses and holding a notepad. "I'm James Becker. I write for the Times. I was at the party last night." Alma nodded slowly. I remember. I've heard many pianists. Oh, but I've never heard someone like you. She didn't respond. I used to cover music before politics, he continued, and I recognized the song you played. Autumn Dust, written by Elaine Weston, correct? Alma stopped watering. Yes, she said softly. I thought so, he smiled. That song was banned after her scandal. It disappeared, but it's a masterpiece. Alma's hands trembled slightly. Mr. Becker looked at her gently. You're her daughter, aren't you? She closed her eyes. Yes, she whispered. But please, don't tell anyone. Why not? 'Cause people like him. She nodded toward the mansion. Don't care about music. They care about mocking what they don't understand? Mr. Becker paused. Would you let me tell your story? The real story? Alma shook her head. Not yet. He didn't push. He just handed her a small card. If you ever change your mind, call me. And he left. That night, Alma sat on her bed again, looking at her mother's photo. She tried to silence your music, Mama, but they heard you last night. Through me. She opened a small notebook. Inside were old music, sheets her mother's handwriting, faded by time, and for the first time since childhood, Alma began to write again. Alma was only 4 years old when her fingers first touched a piano. The keys were too big for her tiny hands, but that didn't stop her. Her mother, Elaine Weston, would laugh softly as she watched Alma hit random notes, then slowly copy what she played. Listen, baby, her mother would say. The piano isn't just an instrument, it's a voice. It speaks for you when your heart can't. Alma didn't fully understand, but she believed her. Their small apartment in the city was always filled with music, even when money was tight. Even when the neighbors yelled to turn it down, Elaine would play in the evenings after dinner, while Alma sat nearby doing her homework. Music felt like home. It was soft, deep, emotional, like the piano knew how people felt. And Alma, she absorbed it all. By the time she was 7, Alma could play small songs on her own, not from books, but from memory, from listening, from feeling. She doesn't need sheet music, Elaine told her friends. She plays from her soul. Alma loved those moments when her mother smiled, when they played together, when the world outside their door didn't matter. She didn't know how rare that was. One afternoon, Elaine took Alma to a local concert, a big performance hall with red velvet seats and golden lights. A famous pianist was performing, someone Elaine had once studied with. Alma sat quietly beside her mother, watching the man on stage. He was talented, fast, loud, but Alma noticed something strange. The last song he played sounded very familiar, almost like her mother's. Elaine noticed too. Her face went pale. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat. After the concert, Elaine didn't say much. They walked home in silence. That night, Alma heard her mother crying behind a closed door. She never forgot that sound. A few weeks later, newspapers printed headlines. Rising star accused of plagiarism, Elaine Weston steals music, loses. Sponsors. Alma couldn't read all the words, but she saw the photo. Her mother's face, twisted by anger and shame. Captured without permission, Elaine stopped playing after that. She sold her piano to pay bills. They moved to a smaller place. Music disappeared from their lives, like a flame blown out by wind. Alma tried asking about it once. Her mother only said, "Some people don't care how beautiful something is. If they didn't create it, they'll try to destroy it." Alma never forgot that either. Years passed. Alma grew up. Her fingers itched to play again, but she didn't. Not without her mother. Not after what happened. She worked odd jobs, cleaning, helping in kitchens, folding laundry, quiet work, safe work. Work where no one asked about her past, but music, it stayed inside her like a secret, like a sleeping bird waiting to fly now. Years later, that bird had sung again one night. One song, one moment at a piano in a rich man's mansion had changed everything. And yet, Alma still wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe it was the way Mr. Coleman mocked her. Maybe it was the silence in her soul. It's too loud to ignore. Maybe her mother's voice still lived inside her, whispering, Let them hear who you are. The next morning, Alma walked to a small second-hand bookstore near her apartment. In the back corner, behind the travel guides, there was a shelf of old sheet music. She pulled out a dusty copy of forgotten composers of the 1900s. Her mother's name wasn't there. She wasn't surprised. She flipped through the pages. So many names. So many songs. But no Elaine Weston. Just as she was putting the book back, paper slipped out from between the pages. Handwritten, she picked it up. It was a short piece of music, titled Winter's Echo. She recognized the writing. It was her mother's. She held the page close to her chest. Tears filled her eyes again. That night, Alma didn't sleep. She opened her notebook. She copied the old song line by line, and then she added to it. She began writing a second part, a response. A memory, note by note. She was rebuilding something she thought she had lost forever. Her mother's legacy, her own voice. Music wasn't gone. It had been waiting back at the mansion. Mr. Coleman sat in his private study, holding an old photograph. A younger version of his father stood next to a grand piano, shaking hands with a woman. That woman was Elaine Weston. He didn't remember the day. He had been a child then. But something in the back of his mind stirred. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a yellowed folder. Inside was a contract signed by Elaine and his father. A performance agreement, a music deal, and a termination notice. Filed just 1 week after the concert. No explanation, just breach of terms. Mr. Coleman frowned. Something wasn't right. He made a call. Alma, meanwhile, returned to the mansion. The next day, she walked past the piano without looking at it. She dusted shelves, swept floors, and polished windows. But her steps were lighter, her eyes calmer. Inside, she was awake again, and she didn't care if anyone noticed. But someone did. The old butler, Mr. Harris, watched her from the dining hall. "Miss Alma," said gently, "would you ever play again?" She looked at him for a moment. "Maybe," she said softly. He smiled. "I hope so. That music, it stayed with me all night." She didn't answer, but a small smile appeared on her lips. That evening, Alma passed by the piano again. It seemed to call too. Her. But she kept walking. Not yet. Not until the time was right. Mr. Coleman was not used to feeling confused. He was a man of money, control, and pride. Everything in his world was measured business deals, wine labels, guest lists. He had spent his life at the top, giving orders and watching others obey. But since that night, the night Alma played the piano, something inside him had shifted. He didn't sleep well anymore. The sound of that melody stayed in his head like a ghost. Every time he tried to forget, he could hear her fingers pressing down on the keys. Why did it bother him so much? She was just a maid. Or was she? He sat in his office, staring at the old photograph again. His father's proud face beside a beautiful black pianist. The same woman who, years later, disappeared from music, Elaine Weston. It couldn't be a coincidence. He remembered something. When he was a boy, his father came home angry one night. Said something about a deal gone wrong, about someone getting too much attention. Could he have done something to ruin that woman? And could that woman really be Alma's mother? The thought made him uncomfortable. But instead of apologizing, he tried to bury the thought. The easiest way to feel powerful again was to make someone else feel small. So the next morning, Mr. Coleman called for Alma. She was sweeping the front hall when she heard the bell. The head butler walked over. "Mr. Coleman wants to see you." "In the music room." Alma felt her chest tighten. She placed the broom aside and wiped her hands on her apron. When she walked into the music room, Mr. Coleman was sitting near the piano, sipping coffee. He didn't smile. He simply said, "Close the door." She did. "Have a seat." He pointed to the small bench by the wall. She sat quietly. There was a long silence. Then he said, "That song you played? Where did you learn it?" Alma looked at him carefully. "My mother. What was her name?" "Elaine Weston." Mr. Coleman's fingers froze around his cup, so it was true. But he didn't show emotion. Instead, he chuckled. Interesting. Alma stayed silent. Mr. Coleman stood up and walked over to the piano. People are talking about you, you know. Some guests called me the next day. Said it was emotional. He rolled his eyes. Funny how easily people are impressed. Alma frowned slightly but said nothing. He placed his hand on the piano lid. Let me ask you this, he continued, now pacing. Did you play that song on purpose? Was it some kind of performance? She looked at him. Was not for you? He smirked. Oh, then who was it for? She didn't answer. His voice grew colder. You know, I could fire you for that little scene. Staff are not meant to be the show. They're meant to clean up after the show. Alma stood up slowly, her voice calm but firm. Then fire me. Mr. Coleman blinked. He hadn't expected. That, you forget your place, he said, trying to sound powerful. Alma looked him in the eyes. I haven't forgotten anything, she said. Not what you said, not how you laughed, not how your father treated my mother. That last sentence hit him like a slap. You think you're above us, she continued, her voice still soft. But you're not. You're just hiding behind your money, your title, your mansion. You don't scare me. Then she turned to leave. But before she could open the door, he said, play one more song. Right now. Want to see if it was real. Or just luck. She paused. I'm not here for your games. It's not a game. It's a test, he said smugly. If you're really that good, prove it. Alma took a deep breath. She looked at the piano. Then she looked at him. No, she said. You don't deserve the music. With that, she walked out the door. Later that evening, Alma stood at the bus stop, her mind racing. She didn't know if she still had a job. She didn't care. Something inside her felt stronger, lighter, as if she had just stepped out of a cage. She looked at the city lights. In the distance, she thought about her mother. She thought about the lies, the shame, the silence. And now, the sound music was no longer her pain. It was her weapon. Her truth. She pulled out her small notebook and wrote down a few lines of a new melody. This one didn't sound sad. It sounded like freedom. Inside the mansion, Mr. Coleman stood alone in the music room. He looked at the piano bench where Alma had sat. He remembered the sound again, the way the guests had stopped, the way the room had changed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he was in control, and that scared him. He walked out quietly, leaving the piano lid open. The next evening, the mansion prepared for another small gathering. This time, it was a private dinner. No grand party. It's just a few important guests from Mr. Coleman's business, circle investors, lawyers, a senator. All men, all powerful. The dining hall was polished. Candles lit, soft music played from the speakers, but the grand piano in the corner was silent. It hadn't been touched since Alma played. Mr. Coleman stood by the window, looking out at the garden. His face was calm, but his thoughts weren't. Every time he blinked, he could still hear her music. Every word she spoke echoed in his mind. You don't deserve the music. He hated how it made him feel. Not because she was wrong, but because deep down, she was right. Meanwhile, Alma sat in the back staff room, folding napkins. Her hands were steady. Her heart wasn't. She had expected to be fired after yesterday, but no one said a word. Her name stayed on the shift list. Her duties stayed the same, but something was different. Every maid who passed her smiled softly. Even the butler offered her tea. There was a quiet respect now. No one said it out loud, but they had all heard the story, or at least part of it. The maid who played like a master. The girl with music in her soul. As the guests gathered in the dining hall, Mr. Coleman stood up to make a toast. He raised his glass. To good business, long partnerships, and unforgettable evenings. The guests clapped politely. Then one of them, a white-haired man in a gray suit, looked toward the piano. I heard something funny the other day, he said. Had a maid who played this piano during a party? Yes. Mr. Coleman stiffened. Yes. For a moment, people are saying it was. Incredible, the guest chuckled, that she played like a concert pianist. Another guest leaned in. Any truth to that? Mr. Coleman forced a smile. Exaggeration. She played one song. People love drama. But the room was already curious. One man called out, "Bring her in." "Let's hear her." Another added, "Yes, let's see the famous Maid." The claps and laughs began again. In the kitchen, the butler entered quietly. "Alma," he said, "they're asking for you again." She paused. "Is it an order?" He looked down. "I believe." "It's a show." Alma stared at the floor. Then she stood. She walked down the hallway alone as she entered the hall. The guests looked over with interest. "She's so young," one whispered. "She doesn't look like a musician." Another said Mr. Coleman said nothing. He only watched Alma walk to the piano. Slowly, she didn't look at the guests. She didn't smile. She sat and placed her hands gently on the keys. Silence fell. Even the laughter stopped. The room waited. Alma took a deep breath. Her fingers hovered over the black and white keys. And then she played. The first note rang out like a bell. Clean, bold. It filled the room. Sharper than any word. The second note followed. Then a third. But this time, the melody was different. Not sad, not heavy. This was a new song. Something she had written the night before. The sound was light, bright, full of feeling. It wasn't a performance. It was a message. She wasn't here to impress them. She was here to be heard. The guests sat quietly, unsure what to say. One man closed his eyes. Another leaned back in his chair. Even the senator stayed silent. Her hands moved like water. Every note flowed from one to the next. Her face was calm, but her body swayed gently, caught in the rhythm. Mr. Coleman didn't move. He couldn't. It was like watching the truth unfold in front of him, note by note, measure by measure. Every sound reminded him he had laughed at this woman. He had mocked her talent. And now he was the one being humbled. When the song ended, Alma lifted her hands slowly. She didn't bow. She didn't wait for applause. She simply stood up and walked out. The room was still quiet until one guest whispered, "That was real." Another said, "She's not a maid." And another added softly, "She's an artist." Mr. Coleman remained seated, staring at the piano. His fingers tapped gently on the edge of his glass. He looked smaller now, almost lost. He whispered under his breath, "Elaine Weston." The name sounded like a secret he was finally ready to face, but it wasn't over. Not yet. He had seen the photo. He had read the contract, and now needed answers. Later that night, Alma walked alone to the bus stop. The streets were quiet. Her feet tired, but her heart felt. Steady she had played, not for applause, not for them, but for herself, and for the woman whose music was stolen. For the mother who never got her justice. The night after Alma's second performance, the mansion was quiet again. Too quiet. Mr. Coleman sat alone in his private study. The fire in the fireplace flickered softly, but he didn't feel warm. His eyes were locked on the photo of his father and Elaine Weston, the same woman who once smiled on that stage full of promise. Now he knew the truth. The woman his father destroyed had a daughter, and that daughter worked in his house. Earlier that evening, no one clapped after Alma played, but not because they didn't respect her. They were stunned, moved, embarrassed. What she gave them wasn't it was something too raw, too honest, too powerful for empty applause. Even the most powerful men in the room sat in silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed. They didn't know whether to look at her or look at themselves. Alma, meanwhile, returned home to her small apartment. She locked the door gently and sat. On her bed, she didn't cry this time. She didn't feel afraid. Instead, she pulled out her notebook again and started writing. Music flowed easily now. It's like a river that had been blocked for too long and was finally free again. She titled the piece, "Unspoken Silence," the next day at work. Alma wore the same uniform. She greeted the same people. She swept the same stairs. But everything had changed. Even the other maids noticed. "She doesn't walk the same anymore," one whispered. She looks like she's carrying something bigger than this house." The butler, Mr. Harris, gave her a respectful nod. "Good morning, Miss Alma." She nodded back. She didn't need to explain anything. The music had already spoken for her. Mr. Coleman stayed in his office most of the day. He didn't yell at anyone. He didn't demand anything. He was lost in thought. He remembered how the media had torn Elaine Weston apart, how the newspapers printed lies about her stealing music, how his father had refused to defend her, had even encouraged the scandal behind closed doors, and now her daughter had played in his house, better than any pianist he had ever hired. Not for praise, not for money, just for truth. He stared at the old contract again, his father's signature, Lane's name, the word. Terminated. No reason given, no justice done. Later that afternoon, a visitor arrived at the mansion. It was James Becker, the journalist who had spoken to Alma. Days before, he was carrying a folder full of papers and old clippings. The butler looked unsure. "Sir, there's a reporter here." Mr. Coleman frowned. "Send him in." James entered quietly. They sat in the study together. The door closed. "You know why I'm here?" the journalist said. Double quotes, yes. "Yes, I've been researching Elaine Weston for years," James explained. "And now I find out her daughter is working in your house and played the same piano her mother once played." Mr. Coleman stayed silent. James continued, "What your father did ruined her life, and no one ever told the truth." "I didn't know," Mr. Coleman said softly. "You know now." James placed the folder on the table. "If I print this, the world will finally know who Elaine Weston really was." "Who?" "Alma is." Mr. Coleman looked at the folder. He thought about the guests, the silence after Alma played, the guilt in his chest, and the weight of his father's actions. "What do you want from me?" he asked. James stood. "Not money, not protection." He pointed toward the hallway. "Apologize to her, publicly, give her back what your family took." Then he left. That night, Alma walked past the piano again. She paused. The lid was still open. She touched the keys gently. But she didn't play. Not yet. Not until the truth was out. The sun was beginning to set when Alma returned to her room at the mansion. She didn't live there, but Mr. Harris, the butler, had offered her a small resting room on the top floor. Sometimes when her shift ended late, she stayed for the night. The room was quiet. A single window looked out at the garden. A wooden dresser stood by the wall. On it, she had placed one thing, a faded black and white photograph. She picked it up carefully. The corners were bent, the glass cracked. It showed a young black woman in a long gown sitting at a grand piano with her eyes closed. Her hands floated. Above the keys like feathers, her mouth held a soft smile. Her name was Elaine Weston, Alma's mother. The photo had followed Alma through every move, every job, every small room she called home. It was the last thing her mother gave her before she passed. "Keep this close," her mother whispered. "One day, they'll know who I was." Now, that day felt near. As Alma stared at the photo, her thumb brushed over the bottom edge, something rough. She turned it over. A thin piece of paper was taped to the back, folded small, nearly invisible. She slowly peeled it off. Inside was a short, handwritten note. It read, "If they silence your name, let your music speak louder. Love, Mama." Alma's hands trembled. She had never seen the note before. Her mother must have hidden it there. Long ago, and now after all this time, her words had found her again. Downstairs, Mr. Coleman sat in his father's old office. The room smelled like dust and old wood. Framed certificates lined the walls, wards, contracts, and photographs from events long gone. He stared at one particular photo. It was the same one Alma kept, but in his version, the camera was wider. Behind Elaine Weston, on the piano bench, a man stood tall in a gray suit, his father. Smiling with pride, the caption read, "Elaine Weston, special guest at the Coleman Winter Gala, 1989. It was the last public photo of her career. Weeks later, she was gone from the music world, silenced by scandal, forgotten by the press, and his father had never spoken of her again. Mr. Coleman opened the drawer in the desk. Inside, was a folder yellowed with age. He pulled it out. There it was again. Termination contract. Signed. Final. And yet, no proof. No reason. No investigation. Just silence. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. His father had destroyed a brilliant woman's future, and now her daughter stood in his house, playing the same piano with the same soul. Back in her room, Alma stared at the note for a long time. Then she stood up and walked toward the small upright piano in the corner of the hallway. It was old, slightly out of tune, but it was enough. She sat down and played the first few lines of Unspoken Silence, the song she had written the night. After playing for the guests, it was soft, gentle, a conversation with the past she imagined. Her mother sitting beside her, smiling, listening. Mr. Harris passed by and paused. He didn't say anything. He just listened from the hallway. Then he walked away, wiping the corner of his eye. The next morning, Mr. Coleman asked for Alma to be brought to the garden. She walked slowly, unsure of what to expect. He stood near the fountain, holding a paper in his hand. It was the photo, her mother at the piano. "I found this in the archives," he said softly. Alma said nothing. "She played here once. Just like you." Still, Alma didn't speak. "I was young. I didn't know what my father did to her, but I know now, and I'm sorry." His voice cracked slightly. "I can't change the past, but I want to make it right." Right. He held out the photograph. Alma looked at it. "I already have one," she said gently. She turned to leave, but then stopped. Make it right for her, not for me. And she walked away. Alma didn't sleep much that night. After Mr. Coleman's apology in the garden, her heart felt heavy but not with pain. It was something else, feeling she hadn't known in years. Peace. Closure. No, it wasn't done yet. Not until her mother's name was cleared. Not until the world knew what had been taken. She sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea. Her notebook was open. Music sheets scattered across the table. The words from her mother's hidden note, repeated in her mind. "If they silence your name, let your music speak louder." That's exactly what Alma planned to do. The next morning, Alma returned to the mansion for her shift. But something felt different. She noticed it the moment she stepped through the staff entrance. The kitchen staff nodded respectfully. The cleaning ladies didn't whisper today. They greeted her like someone they admired, and Mr. Harris, the butler, handed her a small envelope. "From Mr. Coleman," he said. Alma opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. "I have found something. Please come to the study after your shift." See, she folded it slowly and placed it in her apron pocket. By afternoon. Alma's steps led her quietly to the study. Mr. Coleman was already waiting, seated behind the large oak desk. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows behind him. He looked older than usual, tired but calm. On the desk was a stack of documents, clippings, contracts, letters. "I've spent the last 2 nights going through these," he said. Alma remained. Standing, he continued, "There was never any proof against your mother. The accusations were lies. Started by my father. A business decision, they called it. But it destroyed her." Alma's jaw clenched. "I found a letter," he added, holding up a folded paper, written by a former music director stating that Elaine's work was stolen and rebranded under another name. He passed the letter to her. Her hands trembled as she read it. It was proof, real proof her mother didn't steal. Her music was stolen. Mr. Coleman stood and walked toward the bookshelf behind his desk. "I want to offer something," he said. He pulled out a thin black binder. "This mansion holds a winter gala every December. My father started it decades ago. Important people come. Media, musicians, politicians." He looked at her directly. "I want you to perform there, not as a maid, but as a featured artist. And I want to introduce the world to Elaine Weston's music starting with you." Alma blinked. She didn't know what to say. Her heart beat fast after all these years. Her mother's name could finally be honored. Alma took a deep breath, Only if her name is the headline, she said softly. Mr. Coleman nodded. Of course. That evening, Alma visited her mother's grave for the first time in years. She brought fresh flowers and a folded copy of the letter from the study. She knelt beside the stone. Tracing the name with her fingers, Elaine Weston, 1970 to 2004, A Life of Music, I Found the Truth. Mama, Alma whispered. They tried to erase you, but they failed. The wind blew softly, as if her mother was listening. Back at the mansion, Alma no longer wore her maid uniform. She was still humble, still quiet. But something in her had changed. She was finally walking. In the light, no longer a shadow of the past, but the voice of it in her apartment. Alma placed the recovered letter inside a picture frame next to her mother's photograph. Then she sat at the piano and began to play the full version of Unspoken. Silence. But this time, she smiled while playing. The Coleman Winter Gala was now just 2 weeks away. The staff prepared the mansion for the biggest event of the year. Chandeliers were polished, carpets deep cleaned, crystal wine glasses stacked with care. Everyone had heard the news. Alma wasn't a maid anymore. She was now the featured pianist for the gala. No one questioned it, not after what they had heard that night. Not after the silence that followed her music, but Alma wasn't thinking about the guests, or the lights, or the pressure. She was thinking about her mother. Alma stood in front of the grand piano in the music room alone, the same room where it all began, the same place where Mr. Coleman mocked her, and her music shut down an entire party. Now, she sat with purpose. Her fingers moved over the keys with strength and grace. She was practicing a new piece of full performance she had written herself. Using themes from her mother's lost compositions, it was titled Weston's Light. Each note carried meaning, each pause, memory. The song told the story her mother was never allowed to finish. Mr. Coleman passed by the doorway quietly. Watching from the hall, he didn't interrupt. He simply listened. Something about Alma's music felt like an apology he could never say right. Days passed, word spread. A special guest list was being created. A local music academy, a university dean. Even a major music journalist confirmed attendance. They weren't coming for the dinner. They were coming to hear Alma. They were coming to finally hear Elaine Weston's music reborn. Alma visited her mother's old neighborhood one afternoon. It was run down now. Empty lots, boarded windows, cracked sidewalks. But some things remained. The old community center. A rusted sign above the closed music room. She stood outside the fence for a long time. Then she whispered, "You started here, Mama. I'll take you further." She also reached out to Mr. Becker, the journalist who once offered to tell her story. He met her in a cafe and smiled as he saw her confidence. "I knew you weren't done," he said. "I'm ready now," Alma replied. She handed him the letter that proved the truth and a full copy of her gala performance program that night. Received a message from the National Music Heritage Foundation. They wanted to meet her and hear her story at the mansion. A team set up stage lights and sound equipment in the grand hall. A white cloth was hung behind the piano, large golden letters being pinned one by one. Tribute to Elaine Weston, presented by Alma Weston. Mr. Coleman stood at a distance and read the banner. He let out a long breath for the first time in his life. He felt something like honor the night before the gala. Alma stood in her apartment and opened a small box. Inside was the only keepsake she had from her mother's concert, a silver bracelet with the initials E.W. engraved on it. She placed it on her wrist, then looked in the mirror, not as a maid, not as a memory, but as a musician. The night had arrived, the Coleman Winter Gala. Dozens of luxury cars lined the curved driveway. Valets opened doors as guests stepped out in suits and glittering gowns. Cameras flashed. Laughter filled the cool night air. But inside the mansion, something felt different this year. For the first time, the guests weren't just here for wine, food, and money talk. They came for music. They came for her. In the grand hall, the lights were dimmed. The chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors. A stage had been built near the staircase. with a grand piano placed at its center. Behind it, golden letters glowed softly on white fabric. Tribute to Elaine Weston, performed by Alma. Weston, some guest whispered, "Wasn't she one of the maids? Is this really her daughter? I heard her play once. No one said a word the whole night." Mr. Coleman stood near the front row, his hands folded. He had invited many of his father's old partners, the same men who once turned their backs on Elaine Weston. He wanted them to see what they had buried. He wanted them to hear what they had tried to silence. Backstage, Alma stood in front of a tall mirror. She wore a soft blue dress, simple, graceful, timeless. On her wrist was her mother's silver bracelet. Shining under the dressing room light, she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered. Her mother's voice, "Let your music speak louder than anything they ever said." A soft knock on the door. Mr. Harris, the butler. "They're ready for you, Miss Alma." She nodded, then walked forward as she stepped into the spotlight. The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward the stage. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She simply sat at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Then she played the first notes were soft, slow, almost like a whisper, a musical introduction. Not to a song, but to a story. Each note was like a sentence, each chord. A memory Alma played from her soul, combining pieces her mother had written with her own new melodies. The music rose gently, then soared with strength. It was beautiful. It was powerful. It was truth in its purest form in the audience. Not a single person moved. One woman's eyes welled with tears. A man near the back covered his mouth, and near the front, an elderly man who had once fired Elaine Weston lowered his head in shame. Mr. Coleman stood in the shadows. Watching, he felt something deep in his chest, a mix of regret and respect. This wasn't just redemption for Alma. It was restoration for her mother, as the final note rang out. Alma let her fingers rest on the keys for a moment. Silence, not the kind of silence that feels awkward, the kind that feels holy. Then softly someone clapped, then another. Then the whole room rose to their feet. The sound of applause thundered through the mansion, but Alma didn't bow. She simply stood, looked up at the glowing banner above her mother's name, and smiled. In that moment, she wasn't the maid. She wasn't the forgotten daughter. She was Elaine Weston's legacy, and her music had finally been heard. 3 days after the gala, a story appeared in every major paper across the state. The headline read, "The Maid Who Played Truth into the Open, Alma Weston's Performance Rewrites a Family Legacy." Below, it was a photo of Alma at the piano, head bowed, her mother's name shining behind her in golden lights. The article was written by James Becker, the same journalist who once visited Mr. Coleman weeks earlier. This time, the world was ready to listen. The story began with the words, "She walked onto that stage, not to impress, but to remind us that truth doesn't die, it waits. And when it finds the right hands, it speaks louder than silence ever could." James had done his research. He uncovered the buried contracts, the scandal that was never real, the deals made behind closed doors. He named names respectfully, but clearly. And then he told Alma's story. Alma didn't know the article had gone live. She was sitting on the bus, heading home from her morning grocery run, when her phone started buzzing. Non-stop. Texts, emails, social media tags, friends from school, old neighbors, even people she didn't know. Messages like, "I just read your story. I'm crying. Your mom would be so proud. You didn't just play music. You made history. Thank you for standing up." She stepped off the bus and walked home quickly, her heart pounding. When she opened her phone again, she saw something that made her stop walking completely. Her story was now the top trending post on several news sites. Even the National Music Heritage Foundation had shared the article with the caption, "Elaine Weston's legacy lives on. Thank you, Alma, for reminding us that true music cannot be silenced." Across the city, in a quiet office, an older black woman sat with tears in her eyes. She had once played with Elaine Weston in a small jazz club. She had watched her disappear now, Decades later, she saw her friend's name in the light again. She whispered, "You did it, Elaine. Your daughter brought you back." Back at the mansion, Mr. Coleman sat in his office, reading the article for the third time. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was quiet, because in the article, he saw something he didn't expect. A man who changed. James had written about him too, not as a villain, but as a man who had the power to do the right thing. And finally did, and that truth mattered too. Later that afternoon, Alma was invited to speak at a university event. They didn't want her to talk about fame. They wanted her to talk about truth. When she stood on that stage, microphone in hand, she looked out at a crowd of young students. She said simply, "My mother's music wasn't lost. It was locked away. Yet the truth doesn't die. It waits for someone to listen. And when it's finally heard, it changes everything." The room went silent. Then came the standing ovation. That evening, Alma returned home. She placed the printed article next to her mother's photograph. She looked at the smiling face of the woman who had given her everything: music, strength, soul. And she whispered, "You're not just remembered now, Mama. You're respected." A week after the gala and the viral article, Alma sat by her window with a cup of tea. Outside, the city was alive, cars honking, children playing, shopkeepers sweeping their sidewalks. But inside her apartment, everything felt quiet. Not the lonely kind of quiet, the peaceful kind. Her notebook sat open beside her, pages filled with songs, words, and memories she never thought she'd share with the world. And yet, the world was listening now. Her phone rang. She looked down, unknown number. She answered, "Hello." A calm woman's voice responded, "Miss Weston. This is Dr. Lisa Green, director of the National Music Academy." Alma sat up straighter. "Yes, this is Alma. I'm calling because your performance and your story deeply moved us. Your musical ability is extraordinary. Your mother's legacy deserves to be studied, honored, and protected." Alma stayed silent, unsure of what to say. Dr. Green continued, "We would like to offer you a full scholarship to the Academy, a special track to complete your music degree. You'd also be helping us archive your mother's original work." Alma gasped softly. A music degree? She had dreamed of it as a child, but life always got in the way. I don't know what to say," Alma whispered. "Just say yes," Dr. Green replied warmly, after the call. Alma sat frozen. She looked at her mother's photo and softly said, "We're going to school, Mama." Word of the scholarship spread quickly. Local papers printed headlines. From Maid to music scholar Alma Weston to study at National Academy music blogs picked up the story. A podcast called Hidden Voices invited her for a full interview. Suddenly, her story was everywhere again. But this time it wasn't about the scandal. It was about hope. The next day, Mr. Coleman asked Alma to meet him in the music room. She stepped inside. I'm sure why he'd called her. He handed her a small box. "For you," he said. Inside was a gold-plated nameplate. It read, "Elaine Weston Practice Room. I spoke to the Academy." He said softly, "With your permission, I'd like to donate this piano in her name." But touched the nameplate gently. "She'd like that," she whispered. That weekend, a small truck came to collect the grand piano from the mansion. Several staff watched. As it was carefully packed and lifted, it wasn't just wood and strings. It was history. It was justice. At the Academy, Alma walked through the glass doors with a nervous smile. She wore simple clothes, her mother's bracelet on her wrist. A few students glanced at her, recognizing her from the article. A girl whispered, "That's Alma Weston." Another said, "She's the one who made the Millionaire cry." In her first class, the professor gave her an old composition book. It belonged to Elaine Weston, donated by someone who had saved it for years. Alma opened the first page, her mother's handwriting. Danced across the paper, notes, lyrics, ideas, dreams. Tears filled her eyes. She whispered, "We're not done yet." Weeks passed. Alma settled into her new life at the National Music Academy. She studied everyday classical techniques, music theory, history of jazz, but her favorite time was always the quiet hour she spent alone in the new Elaine Weston practice room. The grand piano from Mr. Coleman's mansion sat at the center, clean, polished, full of memory. Each time Alma placed her fingers on the keys, it felt like she was connecting with her mother again, one note at a time. One evening, her professor handed her a sealed envelope. "From the archive room," he said. "We just found this." Alma opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of handwritten sheet music. The title read, "Final Letter" by Elaine Weston. Her breath caught. It wasn't finished. Just a few lines. A soft melody, a deeply emotional. Her mother must have written it in her final years, maybe hoping to return to music one day, but she never got the chance. Alma stared at the page, heart pounding. This wasn't just a song. It was her mother's. Goodbye. That night, Alma didn't sleep. She stayed at the piano until sunrise, reading every line, filling in missing bars, trying to feel what her mother might have written next. She whispered, "I'll finish this for you. One more song. Just for us." 3 days later, Alma stood in a small studio room at the academy. A sound engineer adjusted the mic. A producer watched through the glass. They were preparing a live recording of the completed PS, now titled "Final Letter Completed" by Alma Weston. She sat quietly at the piano. The room was still. Then she began. The first note was gentle, like a whisper from the past. Then the melody built softly, telling a story through music, a daughter completing her mother's final words. Every chord held emotion, every pause held silence that said more than words ever could. As Alma played the last note, she looked upward, not toward the ceiling, but toward the sky. The recording was posted online 2 days later. Within hours, it went viral. The comments flooded in. "I've never cried so much over a piano. This is what healing sounds like. Thank you for finishing her story, Elaine." Alma Weston, 2 voices, 1 soul. News outlets picked up the story again. The music department released a statement, for the first time in history. A mother and daughter have co-composed a piece across time. One began it in silence. The other finished it in song. Back at the mansion, Mr. Coleman watched the performance on his tablet. His eyes were wet. He whispered, "Elaine, you finally got the stage you deserved." The National Academy renamed one of their annual events the Weston Award for Rising Composers in Dalma. She wasn't a maid anymore. She wasn't even just a musician. She was a symbol of truth, of healing, of a voice that refused to stay silent. The wind was soft that morning. Alma sat on a park bench near the academy, notebook in hand, eyes closed. She was writing again, new music, new stories, but all carrying the same heartbeat, her mother's spirit. Suddenly, she felt someone stop beside her. She opened her eyes. An older man, with a cane and a sharp gray suit, stood quietly. "Miss Alma Weston?" "Yes?" she asked gently. "I'm Charles Renner. I used to be a board member at Coleman Records. It's back in the 80s and 90s. Alma blinked. That name. Coleman Records, top her chest tightened. She remembered it from her mother's court papers. The record label that helped erase Elaine Weston. "I came to see you," he said, "because I was there when it all happened. Watched your mother's talent get buried. I didn't fight it. I didn't stop it. And I've lived with that guilt ever since." Alma stayed silent, letting him speak. "I remember one night," he said, voice low. Elaine was in the studio recording a piece. Someone from the label came in, handed her a blank contract, and told her she had to sign or lose everything. She signed, he added. But they replaced her name with someone else's later. Alma's hands tightened on her notebook. "I should have spoken out, but I didn't." He looked at her, now older, softer. "Wounded by truth, I'm here because I want to give you something," he said. He pulled out a small folder. Inside were copies of original studio recordings with Elaine Weston's voice on them, and at The top, a handwritten label, Elaine Weston, original 1991 sessions. Alma gasped. She'd never heard her mother sing before. Just photos, just stories. Now, she could hear her. I kept these hidden all these years, Charles said, standing up. But they belong to you now. She held the folder close to her chest. I don't know if this makes up for anything, he added, but I had to try. Tipped his hat and walked away slowly. Cane tapping against the path, Alma sat in shock. Tears rolled down her face, but this time, not from pain, from peace. That night, Alma sat in her apartment with headphones on. She pressed play. A soft voice filled the room, her mother's voice, warm, clear, soulful. Elaine Weston, alive again through her music. She was singing words Alma had never heard. They can take the lights, but not the flame. They can take the stage, but not my name. Alma closed her eyes and whispered, I hear you, Mama. I hear you now. The next day, she took the recordings to the Academy's archives team. They listened and cried, and decided to digitally remaster every song and release. A tribute album called Elaine Weston found voice the world would finally hear her, not just through Alma, but from Elaine herself. Across the country, famous music producer listened to the early tapes and said on live radio, this woman was ahead of her time. We failed her then, but we're going to honor her now. It was finally ready, the album. Elaine Weston found voice. 12 tracks, 8 restored from old studio tapes. For completed by Alma, every song had been cleaned, balanced, and mastered by the best sound engineers in the country. But it wasn't just an album. It was a voice brought back from the silence. Alma stood outside a downtown theater, where a special listening night was being held. A giant poster hung above the door. Elaine Weston, the voice we nearly lost, presented by the National Music Academy and Alma Weston as. The doors opened. People flooded in, musicians, reporters, students, even older guests who had once attended her mother's early concerts. Some held flowers, some carried old vinyl covers from decades ago, now faded, cherished. They came to honor a woman who had been buried. Not in the ground, but beneath, lies Alma walked in slowly, holding the original folder the old man had given her. Inside the theater, warm lights glowed. A huge screen was set to play visuals with the music photos of Elaine, handwritten lyrics, and piano notations. Alma stepped on stage and stood at the mic. She cleared her throat. The room went still. I never got to hear my mother sing, she said softly, until a stranger gave me what others tried to hide. These songs aren't just melodies, they're memories. And now they belong to all of us. The audience leaned in. She was silenced, Alma said. But tonight, we let her speak. Then, the first song played. It began with a soft hum, then a quiet piano, then her mother's voice. They stole the light, but the stars still knew my name. Gasps filled the room. People wiped their eyes. Some closed their eyes just to listen. For the next 50 minutes, no one moved. In homes across the world, the album launched online, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, radio stations. Within an hour, #Elaine Weston was trending worldwide. A famous artist tweeted, "How did we let this voice disappear, Alma? You didn't just bring her back, restored all of us." At the end of the event, Alma was called back to the stage. Everyone stood, clapped, cried, but she didn't bow. Instead, she walked to the edge of the stage, looked at the screen behind her mother's image, and whispered, "I kept my promise. Mama, they're listening now." The music world changed that night, not because a hit was made, but because a name was restored. Elaine Weston was no longer forgotten. She was finally heard. The next morning, Alma woke up to a flood of messages. Her phone buzzed. Non-stop producers, universities, music magazines, students, strangers. But she didn't rush to answer them. Instead, she sat quietly at her kitchen table, tea in hand. The sunshine pouring through the window. Across from her was the photo of her mother, and beside it her music notebook. Now almost full, she had done what she set out to do. Not just play the piano, not just prove herself, but finish her mother's story. Now it was time to start her own. Later that day, Alma returned to the academy. She walked past students who waved and whispered with admiration. She no longer felt small when they looked at her. She felt whole. She headed straight for the Elaine Weston practice room. There, the piano waited. She placed her hands gently on the keys. No cameras, no audience, no expectations, just music. And she began to write something new. Not from grief, not from anger, but from hope, a piece she would call New Roots. It had no past, no pain, only possibility. Later that week, Alma was invited to speak at a press event. She stood on stage beside a new sign, Elaine and Alma Weston Foundation, supporting young black women in music. A portion of the album's earnings was being used to fund free music lessons and scholarships for girls who had talent but not opportunity. Alma looked out at the crowd and said, "My mother never got her second chance. So now we're making sure no one else has to wait for theirs." The applause was long and heartfelt. Some were crying, some were smiling, and in the front row a young girl, barely 10, gripped her violin tightly and whispered, "That's going to be me one day." Mr. Coleman also attended the event. He didn't speak, but he clapped the loudest, and when it ended, walked quietly over to Alma. He held out an envelope. "This is the last piece," he said. She opened it. Inside was a framed letter, her mother's. Original performance contractor signed, with her name restored. No lies, no replacements, just Elaine Weston. That evening, Alma walked to the park alone. She sat at the same bench where an old man once handed, heard the truth. She looked up at the sky. Clouds drifted slowly. Stars blinked through the dusk. She spoke softly. "You didn't fade. And now, we rise together." The wind carried her words through the leaves, and somewhere, maybe only in Alma's heart, a gentle piano played back in return.